I'd like to welcome you to this public meeting of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is just one meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2019, and on or before September 30th, 2020. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Shayla Garcia. Leah Goodridge. Cecilia Hossa.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Patty Stone. Herman Tejeda. Scott Walsh.
Present.
May Yu.
Present.
David Reese. Present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The next meeting of this board will be a public hearing. 4 public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines will be held on the following dates, times, and locations. Tuesday, June 11th, 2019, in the main theater of Hostos Community College at 450 Grand Concourse in the Bronx from 5 to 8 p.m. Translation will be available in Spanish. Thursday, June 30th, 2019, St. Francis College, Founders Hall, 180 Remsen Street in Brooklyn, 5 to 8 p.m. Interpretation available in Spanish and Mandarin. Tuesday, June 18th, Jamaica Performing Arts Center Auditorium, 153-10 Jamaica Avenue, Jamaica, New York, 5:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Interpretation available in Spanish. Thursday, June 20th, Oberia D. Dempsey Multi-Service Center Auditorium, 127 West 127th Street, New York, New York, 5 to 8 p.m. Interpretation available in Spanish. Directions to these hearings are posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB. Pre-registration to speak at these hearings has begun. You can sign up by calling the Rent Guidelines Board offices at 212-669-7480, then press 0 to register. For further information, see our website. And as always, there are copies of our meeting schedule here today. The final vote will take place on June 25th, starting at 7 p.m. It will be held in the Great Hall at Cooper Union. In your folder, you will find copies of the 2019 Housing Supply Report and changes to the rent-stabilized housing stock in New York City in 2018, both of which will be presented this morning. Copies of the reports are here today, and they will be posted on our website after the meeting. Also in your folder is a memo that was sent to members prior to this meeting. After the presentation of the RGB reports, Rafael Sestero, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Community Preservation Corporation, will be making presentations to the board members. I will now introduce Danielle, who will be presenting the 2019 Housing Supply Report. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you. The Rent Stabilization Law requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider the overall supply of housing accommodations and overall vacancy rates. Therefore, our research staff produces an annual housing supply report which highlights year-to-year changes and trends in the supply of residential housing in New York City, with a focus on findings from the 2017 Housing and Vacancy Survey, new construction and demolition data, conversions and subdivisions, housing rehabilitation, and government housing programs and funding. The major findings of this year's housing supply report are 20,910 building permits were issued in 2018 for housing units, a decrease of 5.5%. The number of new housing units completed in 2018 rose to 26,992, a 4.5% increase over the prior year. City-sponsored efforts will add or preserve 32,203 housing units to the residential stock, 71% of which are preservation projects. Demolitions increased 9.6% to 1,888 in 2018, and there was a 29.0% increase in the number of units in co-op or condo plans approved in 2018 to 10,784 units, while the number of approved plans rose by 3.6%. The number of units constructed with 421A certificates increased by 36.0% to 28,292. The number of units newly receiving J51 abatements or exemptions increased by 30.3% to 29,815. In addition, 11.5% of all rental housing is considered overcrowded, and the citywide vacancy rate was 3.63% in 2017. Preliminary findings from the 2017 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the Triennial Survey of the city's housing stock, were released to the public last year. We presented HVS findings in our earlier income and affordability study, and we report on data related to the city's housing stock for this presentation. New York City is unique in that a significant share of its housing is renter-occupied. The HVS reports approximately 2/3 of the city's housing stock is renter-occupied, compared to 36% for the nation as a whole. New York City has almost 2.2 million rental units, and 44% of those are rent-stabilized. Citywide, the New York City vacancy rate in 2017 was 3.63%. Vacancy rates also vary by rent regulation status. The HVS found a tight market among pre-war stabilized units with a vacancy rate of 2.4% in 2017. Post-war stabilized units also maintained a low vacancy rate at 1.21%, while private, non-regulated units were vacant at a 6.07% rate. The HVS reports that overcrowding varies by rent regulation status, with the highest rates among the stabilized stock. Overall, 11.5% of all rental housing in New York City is overcrowded. That is, there's more than one person per room on average. And 4.5% is severely overcrowded. That is, there's an average of over 1.5 persons per room. Pre-war stabilized housing is more crowded than the average of all rentals, with 12.9% overcrowded and 5.1% severely overcrowded. While post-war units are overcrowded at a rate of 13.4%, and severe overcrowding is at a 6.6% rate. Private, non-regulated housing is less overcrowded at 11.3%, with 4.2% severely overcrowded. As this pie chart illustrates, about 2/3 of New York City's occupied housing stock is renter-occupied. The largest share is private, non-regulated rentals, 43%, followed by pre-war stabilized, 32%, post-war stabilized, 13%, other regulated units at 12%, and rent-controlled units, 1%. Examining the number of building permits issued annually helps to determine the amount of new housing planned each year. Permit approvals for new housing units in 2018 decreased by 5.5% to 20,910, following a 36% increase in the prior year. In 2018, permits fell in all boroughs except Brooklyn, which rose by 37.8% to 8,445 units. The Bronx saw the largest proportional decrease in permits, down 31.5% to 3,698 units, while permits in Manhattan fell 25.5% to 3,584 permits. Permits in Staten Island fell by 11.5% to 606 units, and permits fell in Queens by 10.3% to 4,577 units. First quarter 2019 permits increased 22.4% in comparison to the number of permits issued during the first quarter of 2018, including double-digit increases in 3 of the 5 boroughs, including Staten Island, up 30.3%, Brooklyn, up 30.7%, and Queens, up 153.1%. But permits issued did decrease in the Bronx and Manhattan during the first quarter of 2019, down 29.0% and 21.8% respectively. You can see from this graph that residential building permits decreased 5.5% in 2018, following an increase in 2017. While the city overall had a 5.5...
Can you go back that slide?
Sure.
I'm sorry, what does this slide tell us?
This is the number of new permits issued in each calendar year.
And it went down, oh, I'm sorry, so, this isn't thousands, but it went down, I got it, I'm with you, thank you.
Okay, sure. While the city overall had a 5.5% decrease in permits to 20,910 citywide, This map shows the number of permits by borough in 2018 and the change from 2017. As already noted, permits fell by double digits in Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx, but rose by 38% in Brooklyn. Permit data can also be analyzed more deeply by looking at the reported size of the buildings receiving permits. In 2018, a total of 1,446 buildings received permits, containing a total of 20,910 housing units. Citywide, 28.8% of these buildings were single-family, 28.1% were two-family, 9.0% were 3 or 4 family structures, and 34.1% were buildings with 5 or more units. As the graph illustrates, almost all building permits in Manhattan were for the largest buildings, while in Staten Island, virtually all permits were for either 1 or 2 family buildings. This is for 2018. Yeah. Building size was more evenly distributed in the Bronx and Brooklyn, and to a lesser extent in Queens. Another way of measuring the level of housing creation is to look at the number of housing units actually completed in a given year, which in 2018 increased for the 4th consecutive year. In 2018, there were 26,992 new housing completions citywide, a 4.5% increase over the prior year. Increases were seen in 3 of the 5 boroughs, including the Bronx, which rose by 78.2% to 4,761 units. Staten Island, which rose 28.6% to 863 units, and Queens, which rose by 25.3% to 6,318 units. Completions were down in Brooklyn, falling 15.2% to 9,378 units, as well as Manhattan, down 11.2% to 5,672 units. New housing is also created by various programs sponsored by the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development and the Housing Development Corporation. Through programs like the Multifamily Housing Rehabilitation Loan Program and the Mitchell-Lama Preservation Program, these agencies reported 32,203 housing starts in fiscal year 2018, 71% of which were rehabilitations or preservations, and an increase of 32.3% over fiscal year 2017. The 421A program is designed to encourage new construction of multifamily housing. Owners are exempt from paying additional real estate taxes on the increased value of the property due to the new construction. Depending on the iteration of the program, which periodically expires and is then renewed by the New York State Legislature, exemptions last for 10 to 35 years, and rental properties must abide by all rent regulations during benefits. Participation has been rather variable in recent years, with both significant increases and decreases. Following a very large increase in 2017, the number of units receiving final certificates of eligibility increased again, rising 36.0%. A total of 28,292 units were newly issued final 421A exemptions in 2018.
A question about that.
Sure.
Do you have the data on the temporary? Is that what we call it? Because the building gets the final certificate long after completion. It's not a one-to-one process. And I know the city was trying to get a lot of the temporary people cleaned up.
Yeah, they're still working on cleaning that up.
Yeah.
I don't have the number of the temporary, but I think they are trying to force people to file for the final as soon as completion is done.
As soon as okay.
So, as last year when there was a huge increase, like 70% or so of these units that are getting final certificates had temporary ones well, they all had temporary, but they were enforcing that they get the final. So these were buildings that were already up and running, and they just didn't have the final.
Can you circulate a little bit of that information? I just think for the public members, it's just important to understand that these are not new units entering the system. These are, in some cases, 5-year-old buildings that just never had their act together.
There is a lengthy section on that in the report, which details both from last year, how many units, and then this year, how many units, and the approximate percentage. So that should all be outlined in the report.
I'm sorry, and also, Scott, in Table 4, the data from 2004 to 2018 includes temporary and final. So,
I'm just saying how to use this information and think about new units entering the system. That's all.
yeah, but I think the information from, correct me if I'm wrong, Danielle, but the information from 2004, I think, on solves that problem because it's.
Well, yeah, so Appendix 4 is completions regardless of,
Whether it's TCO or CFO.
That's separate from.
yeah, this is not just, Appendix 4 is not for 421A necessarily. It does include 421A, but it's any certificates, and my understanding is that city planning goes through the records, and they have a system where they do try to come up with what's actually online, whether it's a temporary or a final. And I was looking at the data from this year, actually, and there are buildings where the number of units that city planning has reported as being completed is not the total number of the units that are even going to be in the whole building, because the whole building might not be online. So they're trying to refine that process to get something more accurate. But Appendix 4 is for everything, not just for 421A.
Thank you.
Sure. A total of 28,292 units were newly issued final 421A exemptions in 2018, with 41.9% in Brooklyn and 31.4% in Manhattan. Of the remaining units, 2.0% are in Staten Island, 6.6% in the Bronx, and 18.1% in Queens. Final certificates of eligibility went up in every borough during 2018, increasing 44.5% in Brooklyn, 42.6% in Queens, 21.5% in the Bronx, and 19.3% in Manhattan. Units also rose in Staten Island, up from 32 in the previous year to 579 in 2018. As you can see in this graph, the number of apartment units newly receiving final certification of 421A benefits in 2018 increased for the second consecutive year, following 5 years of decrease. To meet demand in the housing market, office buildings and manufacturing space are sometimes converted into residential housing, or a residential building is subdivided into additional units. A number of SRO building owners have filed to convert their buildings to other uses, such as tourist hotels. In 2018, 83 of these applications were accepted, down 9 applications from the 92 accepted during the prior year.
Danielle, do we know the number of SRO buildings remaining in the city?
We don't have an accurate count of that, no.
Do we have a range? Like, is it like 1,000 or 10,000 or?
I would refer you to the memo that was released last month regarding the hotel data, which is based on HCR filings, but I don't have anything more accurate than that, and I don't remember off the top of my head. I think Andrew's looking for it.
Thank you.
Sure. More than 40% of New York City's owner-occupied housing is in the form of co-ops and condos. Construction of new co-ops and condos, which increase the supply of owner-occupied housing, and the conversion of rental housing to co-op or condo status, which reduces the supply of rental housing, have to be accepted by the Attorney General's office. The number of co-op and condo plans filed in 2018 with the Attorney General increased 3.6%, with a total of 289 plans containing 10,784 units, a 29.0% increase in units. This follows a decrease of 3.6% in units during 2017. Similar to recent years, a majority of the 2018 plans were for new construction, a total of 235 plans with 9,351 new units, and 827 units and 43 plans were for rehabilitation, with the remaining 606 units and 11 non-eviction conversion plans. More than 2/3 of plans accepted were located in Brooklyn, with 70% of the share of accepted co-op and condo plans. And by borough, the most units within these plans were also located in Brooklyn, with 43% of the share of units citywide. As this graph shows, The number of accepted units in co-op and condo plans increased following 2 consecutive years of decline. The purple bars represent the proportion of accepted units that are condos, and the gold bars are accepted co-op units. In 2018, almost all accepted units were condos. Another tax abatement and exemption program available to owners has been the J51 program. J51 was designed to encourage rehabilitation of residential units. As with the 421A program, J51 benefits are available to both rental as well as owner-occupied units. Eligible activities include MCIs, moderate or substantial rehabilitation, and conversion from non-residential use if substantial government assistance is provided. 29,815 units were newly approved for J51 benefits in 2018, a 30.3% increase from the prior year. There were double-digit increases in every borough but Manhattan in 2018, including the borough with the largest number of units, Queens, which rose 63.0%, Brooklyn, which rose 53.9%, and the Bronx, which rose 21.4%. In addition, units rose from 38 to 178 in Staten Island. However, the number of units newly approved in Manhattan fell by more than half, declining 57.4%. This chart shows the fluctuation in the number of housing units newly receiving J51 benefits since 1996. As you can see, levels increased 30.3% in 2018. Another part of the city's housing stock are those buildings that the city has taken title to in the past for the non-payment of taxes. The city in recent years has developed new policies to deal with the non-payment of taxes, including anti-abandonment and third-party transfer programs. In the meantime, it continues to divest itself of the buildings it already owns, and since 1994 has reduced the number of vacant and occupied in-rem housing by at least 99.3%. Leaving a total of just 323 units managed by the city by the end of June 2018, down from a peak of almost 100,000 units in 1986. The New York City Department of Buildings tracks the number of buildings which are demolished each year, which increased in 2018 following 2 years of decline, rising by 9.6% to 1,888 buildings. By borough, Queens had 33.1% of all buildings demolished in 2018, a rise of 7.8%. Brooklyn had a 35.0% share, a rise of 15.4%. Staten Island accounted for 14.1% of building demolitions, a fall of 16.6%. The Bronx had a 10.1% share, a rise of 39.7%. And Manhattan had the smallest share of buildings demolished, 7.7%, a rise of 28.1%.
Yeah. Do we know the size of these buildings?
No, we do not. I don't have any information regarding that.
And they're not we don't know residential versus commercial or?
Correct.
Yeah.
So in conclusion, the number of building permits decreased by 5.5%, just the third decline in the last 10 years, to 20,910 units, while housing units completed increased by 4.5% to 26,992 units. And the interim housing stock remains steady, with 323 units left in the city-managed stock. In addition, 29.0% more units were approved for co-ops and condos, 36.0% more units were certified with 421A tax incentives, while 30.3% more units were rehabilitated with J51 tax incentives, and demolitions increased, rising by 9.6%. And the vacancy rate was 3.63%, less than the 5% legal threshold required for the continuation of rent stabilization. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Danielle, I had 2 questions. So if you look at the table, chart that you showed us with the number of permits over time, so obviously when the lead up to the financial crisis, there was whatever, about 30,000 units a year,
Page 13.
or page...
No, page five.
Page 5, I'm sorry.
And then there's a big drop, and then it never really recovered except for that for 2015. Has the staff at all kind of analyzed why it hasn't kind of returned to that? Do we have any idea of why the long-term trend is that way? And it looks kind of the same with the chart on page 12 with co-ops and condo filings, where it hasn't really returned. Do we have any information as to why that's the case?
Yeah, we haven't looked into that. I can tell you that the jump in 2015 is because 421A was expiring.
Oh, so everyone...
So that accounts for that entire jump.
And that may have dampened it for the following years, so everybody...
It's possible, but other than that, I can't really comment on
Okay.
what's going on. Obviously, there's only so much space in the city. That could be part of it.
That's an interesting... So, I know like the Furman Center did a study some years ago about the amount of available space for construction, but I don't know how we would tie that in with this, but like the running out of space argument, I wonder...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that
Yeah,
definitely,
yeah.
but I think there is an issue. Of course, there's rezoning. If they, zone up and there's more demolitions, we can fit more housing, but otherwise, there's not much place to go anymore.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, and there's it takes longer, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, with the new affordable housing, it's a longer process now.
Since when? Since...
Because a lot of these plans are approved now at the city council level. So there's a lot more that, and I think it takes longer.
What drove that change? Why did that
Well,
happen?
the affordable housing program right. And a certain percentage having to be affordable, and and approving the projects if there's not enough affordability. So there's a lot of different things happening, I think.
Lottery process also.
I'm sorry?
There's a lottery process also.
On the tenant side. Yeah,
Tenant side, yeah. But I think there's that could possibly be it too.
And we don't know what percentage of the permits are for as of right and which percentage are for those requiring city council approval, right? Yeah, okay.
The vast majority of new construction is as of right.
Yeah.
So I would think that, the discretionary process taking longer, that's still a small percentage of this.
Okay.
Yeah, if you look at if you look at new construction, you don't see nearly as much of a decline, or if you look at,
Which chart?
you look at in page 20 for new construction completions, you don't see the same kind of drop-off. So it raises also a question of how many permits actually get realized in terms of being constructed.
Oh.
So I mean, if you look here, you don't see nearly as much drop-off in the last couple of years. It's actually very high.
Because the permits,
Yeah.
the permits are like a leading indicator by how many years? By like 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, well,
There's going to be a steep drop in balance, that's not right.
but the big drop was after the crash, 2009.
In long-term trends, there's never been more than 80,000 units built in a year, and that was kind of in 1929. You can look at this in a 100-year cycle. But, in the 60s and early 70s, we had 50,000 units built a year.
Right.
That's never been achieved again. That was the last high point of the market. During the 80s and 90s, this kind of anemic 5 under 10,000 units was very typical. Only in the 2000s did we see the city break the 10,000 mark for the first time probably in 3 decades.
Well, that's because population had been descending for many of those years. I mean, overlaying. Actually, that brings me to my second question, Danielle. Do we overlay this with population data, like number of units available per capita? Is that an easy enough metric to kind of come up with? Just dividing the total number of building units to the total population.
You mean for new construction or just overall?
Total building stock. Are we losing ground, which we probably are, because population is increasing and total new housing increases more slowly, I think, right?
I mean, I guess I can use the HVS to do that.
Yeah.
I'd have to think about it, but
I mean, if that were easy, that might be interesting to see the line. Not necessarily. Well, I mean, not. I don't know.
It's interesting because I guess I would assume where you're going is kind of looking at almost like predicting vacancy rates over time. Like or do we have enough like supply?
Yeah, or in other words, so it's bigger than the RGB, but, for the city, that's an interesting metric. If you're saying, we're having smaller and smaller households, which I think we are, we're getting closer and closer to 1 for our average household size. It's below 2, I think, right? And then if we have this anemic growth in the housing stock, and we have an increasing population, I mean, that is kind of like a good metric for, housing crisis, I guess.
But we only replace the housing stock once every 100 years, which would be a 1% replacement every year. We should build, how many units a year? Like a little under?
25,000, no?
No, the whole housing stock. What's the whole housing stock number? Is it like 2.5 million?
250,000.
Over 3.2 million, right?
Yeah,
I think it's 3.2 million?
yeah, I think so.
3.2 million. So, right, so that would, if you replace 1%, replacement every 100 years, it's not quite that linear. That would get you to 32,000 units a year that you should build just to replace for obsolescence. And I would argue that replacement every 100 years probably isn't even the metric, right? I don't think we would think the NYCHA buildings would necessarily last 100 years. They're probably a 50-year cycle. So you get to that, plus new population, and there's just none of these numbers on new housing work.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it'd be interesting to kind of have that metric, because I think people would use that metric along the lines that Scott is using it. Just the replacement, the need for replacement, the need for population growth, and kind of seeing that in a number is a useful number to see.
The only one issue that we have a little bit with population growth is the numbers are revised so often. It's really the census where it sets that number. And then they try to estimate population growth on an annual basis, but then they go and they redo the numbers. It's not as...
But even if we did it on the census every 10 years, I mean, just to kind of see see it from decade to decade, what is the ratio of
People do not disclose the right amount in the household size. So
we undercount,
that's-
yeah.
We don't get the correct figure from there.
Yes.
Yeah, so,
Does New York does New York adjusts census numbers, right? When we take a look at, because for that reason, don't we adjust because we think we underreport on
Who
the census?
adjusts? It's not, does the Census Bureau adjust number? Who adjusts them?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But that's the problem we face, right? That when
They do
it-
adjust the population numbers periodically. Also, there's a question of the source of the housing units. I mean, the HVS is every 3 years. The census is every 10 years. The ACS is every year, but it only started in 2005. So there's these different sources to get the number of households. But I think the point has been made here that it really depends on your household size, because if you want to double up or if you don't want to double up, you can keep increasing the population with the same housing stock if you're willing to double up. But if you're not, then even if you lose population, so it's not like a one-to-one rate. If you needed one housing unit for every single person, that would be an easy metric to understand. But because a housing unit can be one person or 10 people, I can do it, but it's not a one-to-one ratio, so,
Maybe that ratio, maybe we shouldn't necessarily do that ratio, but I think having some figures on population growth and even projected could be helpful. I know the Department of City Planning has a demographic group that does population projections, and they work with the Census Bureau when the census does their tracking, so I think they have something the city kind of stands by.
Does anybody on the board want to make any comments or further questions?
Yeah, a couple other questions. The overcrowding, I think it'd be interesting to compare that with other large cities in the United States. How unusual are these rates of overcrowding, severe and regular? Is it particularly acute here in New York City? I think that would be interesting to see.
Other cities, people don't live in cities.
Well, plenty of people live in big cities. I mean, I just see is New York City exceptional in terms of overcrowding or not?
Exceptional in the number of people who live, and then
Well, what percent of the, I'm saying to the extent there's doubling up, to the extent that you have, more than 1.5 people on average per room, which is, I think, the indicator of extreme overcrowding. It's a pretty high percentage here in New York, but I think it would be interesting to see is that, to what degree is that higher or low or average compared to other big cities. I think if you were looking at it nationally, I don't know how meaningful that comparison would be. So anyway, that's one question. Other couple quick.
I'm sorry, Alex. So what do we say, what does the RGB say on Alex's question so far? Do we have that in any of our reports about overcrowding? What do we talk about overcrowding in any of our reports to any?
Well, just
what do we
in
cover?
this report, we report on overcrowding in rental units, and then we break it out by rent stabilized and, pre and post war. And then we take a
I'm
look
sorry,
at the
which
free
chart-
market.
which chart is that? That's,
We don't have it as a chart.
It's in the
A
text.
section on,
Starting on page 5. I will just say that I get these numbers from the HVS, which is only conducted in New York City, so
Right.
I have to check if those numbers are available
I would think
from Census.
The ACS would have.
I would think the
I would
ACS
think, yeah, it would
has it.
have to be but we could only go back to '05, so.
Right. But even so, I think it's interesting just to see, is the level of overcrowding much different here than other places?
and we would look at like San Francisco, Chicago,
Yeah,
LA.
they're large cities.
Boston.
Boston.
Yeah, I would think so. Especially other cities with, large renting populations, I would think. Anyway, just one thing. A couple other little questions. The other regulated housing, is that mostly public housing? Yeah. So
Yeah,
in the,
Most of it's public housing, but it's also Mitchell-Lama.
okay,
and-
so basically subsidized.
Yeah, subsidized housing, yep. That's not rent stabilized.
Yeah, and my last question is the demolitions. Do we have any information on the relationship between demolitions and building permits? I mean, it was interesting to me that, building permits have gone down, demolitions have gone up. I don't know if the permits for demolition, if people get permits for new construction before or after they demolish the buildings, or did anyway, what? Long after.
When you say long after, what do you mean?
I mean, you could get your building permit, but then you would potentially still have design work that you would need to do. So the two are not closely connected.
Right,
So just to be clear, but you would probably, you would get a demolition permit.
You wouldn't demolish until you 100% knew what you were going to do next, unless you had some use that was a hazard to the community and there was a desire for the building to be taken down from a public safety standpoint. But if the building maybe it was a parking garage, or maybe it was a retail tenant, or maybe it had rental apartments in it that you needed to figure out what was the next iteration for that building, you would keep it occupied until fairly close to the demolition period.
I guess what I'm asking, I'm not sure if there's any way of knowing, but, with an pretty sharp increase in demolitions along with a decrease in building permits, could demolitions be considered sort of a leading
It's-
indicator for building permits in the future?
I
or-
don't think it can be related because the demolitions are demolitions of any kind of structure, and the permits that I report are residential permits, so it's hard to know if something's being demolished to make way for residential, or if it's being demolished to make way for another commercial structure. I don't think it's possible to compare them accurately.
Danielle, have you ever looked at a demolition permit? Like, what is the data that would be contained in demolition permit? Anything, or is it just the building on this block and lot is permitted to be demolished?
I've never seen the actual permit. I have looked at some of the data the Department of Buildings puts out, these reports about all the permits. I will say that when I look at what they put out and what's listed as demolition permit, it never matches up to what they tell me the number of buildings demolished are. So there's some part of it that I'm not understanding, because it does not match up. But I can send you, what they put out. It's just an Excel spreadsheet, but it's, yeah, I'd have to look at it more closely, but it never matches up to what they say the number of demolitions are. So there's some missing piece there that I don't have access to. And I can't, I don't know what it is exactly.
But I guess when you look up a demolition permit or when you file a demolition permit, it just has the current use. So you don't, there's not necessarily an indicator of what will come next.
But you mean like residential?
Right. I mean, so often it's like vacant or the current land use is allowed by zoning.
Yeah, I know nothing about this, but just surprising that if you're demolishing a 20-story building, that the permit is kind of effectively the same as if you're demolishing a single-family home. It just seems like there'd
Well,
be,
I think there's more safety issues. I mean, it has a much further review. I mean, if it's something that's working, I'm sure we could get.
yeah, I'm just
a
curious,
construction
yeah.
expert to teach us how.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not probably important enough.
It's more of a public safety issue.
Okay.
And how the building is going to be taken
Demolished,
down.
yeah.
If there's asbestos in the building, there's other contaminants. You have to put your public safety hat on,
Mhm.
is what DOB is solving for in reviewing the permit application, issuing the permit.
Mhm.
They're looking for the means and methods of demolition, unsafe conditions, perimeter protection, et cetera.
Mhm, mhm. Okay. Other comments from the board or questions from the board? Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.